to, we'll move straight on to session 3. We are a bit delayed for time, but we've got a break coming up after that, so we'll try and catch up then. I really want to give everyone ample time. So our next session, we're starting to move into some of the specific voices that may be speaking up and speaking out. In this case, we're looking at industry voices. In particular, we're looking at our industry, that is. So we'll start off with Susie, who also has co-authors on her paper. And Susie, if you are able to, are you ready and able to share your screen?
Yes.
There you are. Yep.
Can you see that?
Not yet. I can see you, I can hear you.
Okay.
Do you need some help there, Amy? Can you advise Susie?
It's a bit tricky when I'm not in the room with you, isn't it? Do you need some help getting the share screen up and running?
Can you see it now?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, no, drats. I'm wondering if one of my co-presenters can share screen.
Susie, I'll try.
Thanks, Kay.
I'll also try.
It's not my first time at the rodeo, but there you go.
Okay, yeah.
Kay, you happy to drive it?
Yeah.
Thanks, Kay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Okay, well, thank you, Susie, if you wouldn't mind getting us kicked off and talking about our industry. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Leanne. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to, be presenting my first time at the PRIA Symposium, so it's great to be here. And I've got four fellow researchers, 3 fellow presenters who I think have been in PRIA forums before. So my name is Susie, and I'm joined today by 3 colleagues from UTS, from the School of Communication, Professor Maureen Taylor, and from the UTS Business School, Associate Professor David Waller and Dr. Kay Chan. And even though she's not with us today, I wanted to acknowledge the amazing contribution from Dr. Trina Clark from the Centre for the Advancement of Indigenous Knowledges, or CAKE as we call it at UTS. So we are a cross-faculty research team. Our teaching and research has intersected, previously, and we wanted to formalise that with a project. And this is really I'm calling it baby's first outing. So this is the first time we've really sort of made some noise about this research project that we've recently started. Thanks, Kay. So one of the things that we are trying to do is consider how effectively and how earnestly Australia's marketing, PR and advertising agencies are engaging with diversity. And so we have a central research question and imperative that is driving our collaboration, which is how can we increase and strengthen diversity commitments across Australia's advertising and public relations agencies. And we know that diversity has become both a buzzword and a hot potato over the last few years. And we know that, questions around diversity or lack thereof have triggered, industry-wide reckonings across the comms and entertainment and media landscapes. And we see our work as an academic intervention, but also contribution to how well agencies are dealing with questions around diversity. Thanks, Kay. And so our research is in many ways starts with a stock take of how well the industry has responded to an explosive report that was released in 2016 from PricewaterhouseCoopers. And it was their Entertainment and Media Outlook report. And it surveyed the demography of workers, in agencies in Australia. And its findings were, a very sobering reminder that the industry really lacked the diversity and that that was mirrored in the Australian population, and particularly for an industry that revels and trades in diversity and creativity. It found that the average industry worker was a white male aged around 27 and living in one of Sydney's eastern or inner west suburbs. So in many ways, the report produced, this very stereotypical picture of the much maligned hipster was the typical industry worker. The industry worker was extremely monolingual. 82.7% of the national entertainment and media workforce only spoke English at home. 37% lived in Sydney or one of the or Melbourne, and just a few years later, the numbers weren't much better. And the one particular sort of statistic that we're particularly interested in is that by 2019, less than 1% of this workforce self-identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And as academics and researchers in this space, we were curious to see how well the industry was responding to these findings, because at the time, industry press was, it was kind of flooded with determinations and commitments to do better, and this kind of realization that robust efforts had to be made in this space if the industry was to be more diverse and more inclusive, and kind of fold more voices and perspectives into its workforce. And so our research in many ways starts with a stock take to see if all these words were matched with concrete measurable actions. And so what we've created is a research project that we see as just a first stage in a much wider exploration and investigation into how well agencies have embedded diversity initiatives across marketing, PR and advertising agencies. And we're looking at it with a view to see how we can sort of help create a nice trajectory from education through to employment, and to see how well diversity is being factored in industry, but then how we can sort of match and mirror those commitments to diversity by through certain initiatives through the education sector. We understand that diversity is a malleable and elastic term. It's an umbrella term that's used to cover myriad subject positions, community groupings and cultural identities. And we expect in time that we will broaden our research to factor in these various iterations of diversity. But in the first instance, we are focusing on how well agencies, and in particular member agencies of the MFA, factor Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander recruitment into their diversity programs. So we know that many agencies have got diversity programs in place already. We're checking in, to kind of gauge their efficacy. And so this early phase of our project was developed in close consultation with CAKE at UTS in terms of the kinds of questions that we are putting to members of the MFA, but also to help us establish what is best practice, because part of our exercise is to determine benchmarking criteria by which best practice at international agencies is being addressed, and to map alignment between industry practices and policies, as well as university efforts to better recruit, retain and mentor diverse student groups within our disciplines, because of course we come from both business and communications. Thanks, Kay. So we have a 3-part research timeline. We've completed the first stage, which is basically a lit review, a stock take, if you like, of how Australian agencies have put in place, since the release of the PwC report, principles or policies to address what we knew was a lack of diversity in their organisations. So we've done quite a lot of that already. The second stage, which we're in the middle of now, are interviews and surveys of HR personnel from member agencies of the Media Federation of Australia, and that will consist of primary data collection. We want to identify what standards and goals they've put in place. And we also want to hear about their, how these measure against their own expectations, and also what they expect of educational institutions in terms of assisting recruitment of diverse workforces. And finally, we will collate their feedback and analyse that alongside our review of best practice examples from stage 1. And we've heard that there are places in the world where this is being done well, where agencies have very earnestly and successfully factored diversity into their attraction, retention and promotion of culturally and linguistically diverse personnel, particularly in Canada and New Zealand. So what we would like to do is look to those best case examples and see if we can fold some of their practices and recommendations into our work, which we then share with industry, but also embed into our own education and training. Thanks, Kay. And ultimately what we want to do is scale our research up and out. So ultimately we would like to also interview a diversity of high school students. We want to see what their perceptions are of this industry, and whether they see themselves working in an agency, that maxim, if you can see it, you can be it. Well, we'd like to know if they can see themselves working in agency settings. We would like to survey a diversity of current university students in our discipline, and also to see if, how they perceive their own graduate capability development, as well as cultural resonance with agency sector. We would like to ultimately survey non-HR staff in advertising, PR and marketing, just to see if there is a viable presence of diversity across agencies, but also the extent to which there's a diversity of perspectives, experiences and cultural identities across executive decision making. And ultimately, we would like to broaden the scope and scale of our dialogue with industry to include other, important seminal organisations like PRIA and like the Advertising Council of Australia, as well as the International Association of Business Communicators. And I think I will now pass the baton to one of my fellow presenters.
Thanks, Susie. I think you've covered this, but what's key, apart from the fact that we're coming from the marketing group in the business school and the communications group in our Faculty of Arts and Social Science, is that we're also working with industry. And we're partnered with the MFA because that's where Susie, Maureen and David and I come together when we're working with students and media and things like that. So that's where we've initially started, but as Susie said, we'd like to extend that out. So we've partnered with the MFA, really particularly, as she mentioned, in the second stage of the research with the qualitative interviews. And what's interesting about the MFA since we've started this partnership is they've also launched their diversity, equity and inclusion working advisory group this year. And currently we see in the marketplace a census looking at where they are today to understand, so that they can see what the impact there is. So very much the agenda and the position that we're in and they're in is very much on the same page. And as Susie mentioned, some of the extension work that we think we'll end up hopefully being able to do with high school students and tertiary students is really looking about what's the perception of potentially our industry and if there's barriers to it from a DEI perspective. As Susie also mentioned, we've collaborated with CAC in terms of the questions we're asking and what we're doing, and that collaboration will continue to occur. Now, phase 1 is the secondary research, and where we've pretty much done an audit of what's out there in terms of what are the agencies publicly doing. Now, as one of the first things we found was there's a lack of data, and obviously that's been captured by the diversity advisory group because they've put a census out this week to kind of get that data and get that line in the sand after the research that was done a few years ago. But if we look at a content analysis of the MFA member websites, we can see only 60%, or fantastically 60%, 60% lacked the DE&I acknowledgement and or mention of diversity strategy. So 40% are doing it at the moment. 30% of the 40%, 30% explicitly stating the value of DE&I and have talked and used news around it. And 10% were even more active, talking about it on blogs, having their reconciliation action plans published or explanations about it. So really we can see where that line is from this content analysis, and again, looking at where that's going. In terms of the social media and looking at the member agencies' social media sites, we can see that 25% demonstrated diversity statements on their social accounts, predominantly around the major diversity action days. But notedly, only 3 agencies are celebrating multiple diversity demographic things. So it tends to be potentially a one-off, and when it's remembered to be done, etc. So from here, this is phase 1. We're going into phase 2 at the moment, and Maureen's going to go into that in more detail. And this is where we're really doing the in-depth key informant interviews with the HR team to really look at what we're seeing from the public content audit point of view, and to see what's happening and to see where they're going, and obviously start to uncover and see where some of the barriers may be in terms of where we sit as a tertiary institution, but also potentially the students we're recruiting. And so I'm going to pass on to Maureen, who's going to go into some of the initial findings from this.
Great, thank you. And it's you probably can't see it, Kay, but the chat has blown up with so many people in this conference right now who have come before us on this topic. So that's really exciting because, as you'll see on our next slide, we're not the first to do this. We won't be the last to do it, but we would love to build a strong network with other scholars and practitioners who have been doing this. So let me talk a little bit about what we found so far, and we have some more interviews set up for next week, and then we'll probably start again after the new year. So we asked a question about recruiting. Right, we wanted to know, where are people getting their talent? And the answer generally is that it's through networks, through professional networks. So one interview brought me through the steps of, we contact our friends in the industry, we contact our friends at local universities who might have some students who are outstanding, who are graduating and might be interested in joining us. And that is fantastic, right? We all know the strength of weak ties is a wonderful way of finding people. But the problem is, in hiring, the research does suggest that this creates birds of a feather, right? And the birds of a feather flock together. I'm not sure about Australia, if we have that staying in the United States. Your birds are all over the place screaming at each other all of the time. So maybe this isn't the best analogy for it. But one of the issues is that the recruiting is going through your networks, and generally our networks are homophilous, right? They're like us. Number 2, that one of the things that we found that they are starting RAPs, and that the RAPs are including both personal, I commit to a day of reflection, I commit to this as a person, and then as organizational activities as well. The term diversities and diversity came up a lot, and a few people mentioned the idea of creating a workspace where everyone feels valued, right? That's one of the ways that we will create an inclusive environment where everybody, regardless of their background, perspective, et cetera, feels comfortable. So it's not just we want diversity for diversity's sake, but we want to make everybody comfortable in their diversities. And then I was surprised at how much interest there is in this academic industry partnership. And actually, it makes perfect sense as I look at the people on the call, because you've been already working with people in industry and already have those extended connections. Next slide, please. So this is just one of the examples. So we're doing MFA. So we're starting with advertising agencies, because that was our first stab at it. I just wanted to show you this is the, let's see, I can't read it. I've got it on my screen over here. Hold on. This organization helps people from Indigenous backgrounds to find employment. And when I put in the word advertising, only 3 came up. You put in public relations and 40 come up. You put in marketing and 50 come up. So this is an unmet marketing opportunity to reach people, to actually put the ads, not just use our networks to reach people, but actually to go through organizations that serve many different types of people. All right, next slide. So what can you do to help, right? So do you know of any agency that's doing a great job in diversity and in hiring or in creating that inclusive atmosphere? We would love to know about it. Does your university, school, or faculty have any formal or informal initiatives to increase diversity in the communication fields that you could share with us? Are you working on a similar project like Marianne, your research in your presentation recently, right? That would be a great opportunity for us. And if you have any of these ideas and you want to start perhaps like a working group, or we can join your groups, we would love to do that as well. It doesn't have to be an individual, right? We're all in the networking industry. So it would be a great opportunity for us to come together. MFA is helping us at this point, but I could definitely see opportunities for PRIA as well. So I think it's time. I think we've gone our 13 minutes. So I will end and turn it over to our facilitator.
Thanks, Maureen and Susie. And I've just missed someone in the middle.
David.
David.
He was here, but he was quiet. David.
Right. Thank you all. And Kay, yes. That was really interesting. And I think it might pay, even though we're running short of time, it might pay for any quick questions now, because our next paper takes a bit of a different approach. So while we're talking diversity, and it's been very active in the chat room, is there anything very quickly that anyone would like to say or ask? No, I think everyone is being really nice about our time restrictions. So thank you. I'm sure the conversation will continue from here anyway. Robert Gill is our next speaker. Rob, are you back? Yes, and available? Terrific. If you'd like to tell us more from another industry perspective, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just share my screen. So has that come up for everybody?
Yes, yep. Just need to go to presentation mode.
All good?
All good.
Right. Okay, so I have been looking at, since our wonderful COVID pandemic took hold in Australia, I've been looking at how this has affected our student work integrated learning placements or professional placements or internships or whatever terminology you would like or prefer to use for when our students go off and engage directly in the industry and work within the industry. So as most of us have experienced over the last 18 to 22 months, since really about February 2020, we have been through major disruption in terms of being able to physically engage with our students, to be able to have our students on campus, to be able to work in an environment with our students where we're in this face-to-face exchange. And of course, that has implications not only for teaching, but for our students and our near graduating students particularly, who often like to take on some sort of professional roles to ready themselves for when they go out in the industry. So these professional placements have had a considerable disruption due to the COVID pandemic, not allowing businesses and also government regulation around face-to-face or personal contact. So the paper went and had a look at a stack of journal articles that have been written since the pandemic began up until about May this year, to see if I could pinpoint what are the key focuses or the key points that other academics are recognising around work integrated learning and professional placements for their students. I looked at 7 papers. I know it sounds like quite a small pool, but when I did actually do the Google search, and it didn't come up with a lot. And my keyword searches around work integrated learning and professional placements and student internships and all those types of things, those similar words, I still came up with a very limited selection of papers. But I did manage to do quite an extensive literature review on remote working and professional communication. And one thing that quite surprised me is that there's a hell of a lot of stuff that's been written about remote working and working online and doing internships online that was written many, many years before we actually went into this COVID pandemic and isolation. So I know there's a number of universities, as that's the same with Swinburne, who have actually been operating in this remote internship sphere anyway. A lot of universities that are located outside of the bigger cities often find it difficult to get internships or professional placements with particular organisations that, you know, base themselves in their head office and their major operations out of the bigger cities. So this is something that's not exceptionally new to a lot of universities. I also did this case study comparative analysis to see, we'll try and get a bit of a heat on what were the main things that were being highlighted or referenced in these particular papers. And it was all done under the understanding that our students in a COVID normal world are probably going to need slightly tweaked or different set of skills to what we would have envisaged they would have needed 2 years ago in terms of being able to hit the ground running when they graduate, go into professional positions. So what I found in the literature that was glaringly coming out to me was that, I'll start with remote placements and what we mean by remote placements anyway. So basically it's about completing some sort of professional work or work placement or will, whatever you'd like to call it, away from the office environment. And typically this was done by students at home because obviously a lot of them didn't have access to their campuses at this time. Prior to that, I know that from my own experience, a lot of the students actually came into their university campuses to do their remote placements if they were doing an internship online. Professional purpose is a term that's been put together by Bates, Ricks and Carbone and Pilgrim, and it's really focusing or zeroing in on that sense of professionalism and understanding about what are the skills you will need to make a positive impact when you end up in the workplace. So it's not just about employability skills, but it's an ability to understand what you will actually be doing and how you can hone those skills, preferably obviously before you actually get into that working environment. Employability skills are the attributes that students will have on graduation, and obviously in this transforming work environment, the old 20th century sort of man-focused, manpower-focused workforce is now moving into this technology-powered workplace. And this has been accelerated, obviously, by the fact that COVID put a lot of our workplaces into a remote operating stance. So it was, in essence, forced upon a lot of our working organisations who maybe 2 years ago might have been a bit reticent to actually engage in this idea about letting your workers work from home or work in a remote location. So the philosophy and actually the physical changes that were imposed upon us by COVID have had an impact on the way that people see or now see what the professional workspace looks like. So does professional communication require a shift in what we call these employability skills that we would have highlighted, 2 years ago? So I've put up there the table of the findings. Please don't strain your eyes to try and read all those. But after doing the Google search and coming up with these 7 papers, these are the key findings that jumped out at me. So all 7 papers championing the legitimacy of remote working. So they said, yep, it's a great way to do it. There are some important skills that you will develop by doing a remote internship, and it's going to be very relevant in terms of what the new workplace would look like. Obviously, it advances the students' digital and remote interactivity skills. So being able to use digital communication, being able to use a diverse range of digital communication tools and platforms, but also how do we interact online in a professional sense now that we don't have that face-to-face ability to read the room. What was also highlighted is that individual aptitude is promoted. So students and obviously interns take on a more sense of independence. They build resilience because they have to find their own solutions. Often the delay in being able to get help or immediate help and even help from the university is time delayed due to the fact of technology and not being in the same room together at the same time. So this individual way of finding solutions has been promoted because of the situation. Also, clever ways around how to engage with your team and keep that collaboration engagement going. So, you know, work is not just for all of us. It's not just a place where we get on with our own individual tasks and responsibilities, but it's also a place where we engage with others and we share some sort of social interaction. So how do we incorporate that into a remote working environment? The boundary spanning capabilities, being able to transition from one work environment to another, and the greater reliance on university or technology for support. And what was mentioned in a couple of papers was the idea around, okay, poor connection and not being able to access good, strong internet connection or Wi-Fi at all times. And of course, for a lot of students, they might be in share houses, and this was compounded by the fact that there might have been 3, 4, 5, 6 different students on the internet at the same time. So here they are trying to present themselves in a professional manner in a professional workplace while working remotely. But of course, they're sharing the internet with another 6 people. And the same thing happens when you're in a family environment at home and there was homeschooling. And of course, another key point was the influence of isolation and how you don't feel connected or engaged with your fellow work group, particularly people that would be managing you in that will incident or that will environment that you're in. So the conclusions that I drew out of the analysis was that all 7 papers were in the positive ledger. So there were many, many positives to this idea around working remotely in a remote environment, but being part of a professional setting. The tone of the papers that I picked up, so this is a bit of a personal observation, they all seem quite enthusiastic about the idea around remote placements and the way that remote placements actually develop more relevant skills for what will be the workplace of the future. Most papers highlighted the idea around the level of anxiety for students with lack of engagement or poor engagement, or, you know, a 2D type scenario of engagement, and the idea of working in isolation and having to make decisions. The literature pointed to what is perceived as a blended model of working for the future working environment. So, you know, people will not go back into work in the same way as they did on that, you know, 9 till 6, 9 till 5, commuting into work environment, working in an office, and then leaving the office. So this idea about a blended model where that might involve 2, 3, 4 days a week, or a week here and a week off and a week in that working environment will be very different. So this obviously helped to shape professional purpose for those students that were able to do a remote will placement. Considerations One was around student equality and the access to technology and the access to reliable internet. The other point that was raised was about the campus safety net and being able to be on campus or to be able to have a strong link and engagement with academic staff or supervising staff that may not be as prevalent when you're working more remotely. Obviously, that human nature, that desire to, physically engage and interact with people. But also an interesting point that was raised was around the culture gap and, how we can lose a lot of interpretation or develop misinterpretations through online communication where we're not using things that are, are more traditional kind of information sharing that goes on in different cultures. Things that are more physical, like the way you dress, the way you present yourself, the way that you look at particular people, engage with particular people, the tone of your voice, all these sort of things can be lost in online communication. And finally, that networking capability, which may have a positive or negative effect because, as our last presenters were talking about in terms of recruitment, networking is a big way of recruiting. So if you have already been engaging and demonstrating these professional purpose skills that involve digital communication and you do it very well, then that's going to highlight your abilities in this area, which are going to be very important areas moving forward. So that's my little discussion on, whoops, went too far. Oh, yeah. I had a big thank you there. It seems to have dropped off my slide, but thank you for listening. And I'll be really interested to hear from fellow academics that have done similar work.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was an interesting look at our current environment, and I'm sure many will have had been dealing with many of those issues. So do we have any questions or discussion points for Rob? Rob, if you'd like to, yeah, that's it. Terrific. Thanks. No, I think, Rob, you're falling into that place of the last speaker before the lunch break, but everyone will be able to find Rob through our site, but he's also at Swinburne University. So with that, we will call it an end to this session. We will take a lunch break. We've gone a bit over, but if we could perhaps ask everyone to come back at the allotted time, which is 1 o'clock Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne time, so in 31 minutes, and we will start our next session after that. But thank you all. Have a bit of a break, stretch your legs, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much. If you want to stay logged on, just mute, and we'll join you later.